Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the brand new REDink Writers podcast. My name is Sam Withage and I am a designer, illustrator and a newbie writer working hard on my very first epic fantasy series of 2 Realms.
And my name is Sandy Butchers. I am the author and illustrator of the Singularian Grimoire anthologies on Patreon and currently in the query trenches with one of my full novel manuscripts. I'm super excited to bring you this podcast by writers for writers.
And my name is Lydia Stevens, author of the Ginger Davenport Escapades. I'm a developmental editor with creative content critiquing and consulting and a former literary agency intern at CMA Lit. I also worked as an acquisitions assistant with Anthem Press. This episode, we have a wonderful lineup of hot topics within the writing community. Today is all about who we are and what we do, and we will spend some time answering the questions that followed our Twitter poll earlier this week. This means we will be talking about how to write that dreaded synopsis and the do's and don'ts of query letter writing.
Today's episode is brought to you by us because we don't have any sponsors yet. However, if you do want to sponsor one of our next episodes, please reach out. You can find us on Twitter or Facebook at REDink Writers.
This is it, our very first episode, and it's been quite a ride to get this whole thing out there. Earlier this week, we started with the Twitter promotion, and there was one burning question from our followers. What is REDink?
REDink is something that has been on our minds for a while. In fact, I think it started when you, Lydia, said something like, I've got this. And then I added, but you don't know what the fuck you're doing. So how this usually goes when one of us makes a joke is that we start to use that line more and more often to a point where we kind of decided that it should be our motto as writers.
I think that really sort of plays into the whole, hobby, profession, or something like that. As a writer, though, it's you sit down at the computer and you have an idea, but you don't know what the fuck you're doing. And then you just go with it until you have this manuscript where you think to yourself, hey, maybe I could actually put this out into the industry. And yeah, so that's how the whole motto and the idea formed, I think, was that critique session.
Yeah, and I remember I made exactly the same joke to Sam, and then she texted me saying, oh, we should do a podcast on this.
Yeah, I remember that, and I actually do think that that kind of snowballed because I was in that phase where I had no idea how I was going to get all the world building for my fantasy series, and I started kind of going down a rabbit hole and I didn't know how to fix stuff. And we're kind of like, you got this! But I don't know what the fuck I'm doing.
Yeah, I think that was a general vibe. We were all doing stuff and we just didn't know what the fuck we're doing. And now here we are.
And here we are. Yeah. I still don't know what the fuck we're doing.
But we're doing it.
So when we say that this podcast is by writers for writers, we completely mean that because we're all each at a different stage in our careers, and I think that having something to be able to bring to the writing community where we can relate to everybody and everybody can maybe relate to us and the writing journey that we're on, because none of us know what the fuck we're doing. We just sit down and we do it. I mean, that's just the definition of being a writer.
Yeah, and I'd also like to, because that was it was a joke when I said to Sandra, maybe we should do a podcast, because, I mean, everybody and their moms has got a podcast these days. But it's kind of a joke, and then we started talking about it seriously, and we realized that, yeah, of course, there's so many writing podcasts already, and everyone is kind of already doing some of these topics, but I thought the mix of the three of us at the different stages within the writing journey that each of us are made for a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's also, I mean, all those podcasts that are out there now, like most people do something to just tell about themselves and maybe even for themselves. And I think what we want to do with this podcast is actually bring it out there for other people. Like we three of us together, we actually know quite a lot. I mean, Lydia is familiar with the whole publishing industry from the agent's point of view. Sam and I, you are writing and we are both illustrating, and we are we are in there from a completely different perspective, and I think sharing this for other people is kind of what puts us out there.
I completely agree with that. I remember having the conversation after Sandy had spoken with you about the podcast, and she said, Sam had, wants to do a podcast, and it's something that through the years of my career, I've always wanted to be able to do something to bring something back to the writing community and share my expertise and help other writers. And I remember thinking, I wouldn't know how to set up a podcast. I'm not great with the tech stuff. I'm not great with the graphics. But then you bring in your expertise with the graphics and the audio recording and the, being able to do all that stuff. And I think collectively we can bring something that, when we put this all together and when we put this out here for the community, that it will work and we can share our collective knowledge. So I'm really excited about that because it's something that I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to get this kind of an endeavor off the ground, and yet here we are doing it, and I'm super excited for it.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking back now, like where did we even get the red ink? It had a meaning.
Red ink editing. We're a critique group, and so we sit there and we go over each other's work and we bounce ideas off each other, and we're so organic and genuine that if it's something that doesn't work, we're just like, no, fuck this. Cross it off. That whole idea.
Yeah.
I remember I literally had pages just with red ink everywhere. So I think it's kind of fitting to have red ink as the name of the podcast because we are looking into the whole editing and into the writing. And yes, we are going to meet that red pen at a certain point and just, I don't know, cross out everything that sucks. So yeah.
Sam had a great metaphor, I think, as well. Blood, sweat, and tears. Because as writers who don't know what the fuck we're doing, we do put the blood, the sweat, and the tears. And I love our logo for REDink is the little red splash. You can add the splotch, and it could either be the red ink or it could be, the
writer's blood. Make it gore.
I think, Sam, as a little present a while ago, I gave you one of those thermo mugs with the recipe for I don't know, was it the recipe for success or something? And it had like the blood of an author and 2 cups of author's tears and everything. I don't know, I don't even remember what was on it, but we have the same mug now. And just thinking back of red ink and that mug, even that matches.
Yes, it matches to a T. And at one point I was like, this has so many different aspects because REDink, like you both previously mentioned, by crossing something out. But even for me, as someone who is more into the romancy, smutty books, I was like, well, REDink could kind of be romantic. So it kind of fits all of us, even as the kind of writers that we are. So REDink writers just works.
And even as illustrators, we all had the period of time where we used pens and they would leak their ink and you would have like a colored hand and it ended up being red or blue, whatever color ink you were using. So even there in the illustration part of what we do, this comes back.
Yeah, 100%, I agree with you. And as someone who's in the design world, usually when you build a brand, the name of the brand is something that you brainstorm to death. And you've got to check everywhere whether or not it's been taken and what kind of associations that you did. And just REDink writers, there it was. Didn't need to think about it. Didn't do any of those things, but it worked and it's perfect.
Yeah.
So, and I would definitely say I love the fact that REDink can mean something different for each one of us, even though there's a general idea behind what the meaning is for a writing podcast. Everyone can relate to that and kind of bring their own experience in the writing process to that brand and that logo. So that's what I think I love most about it, is how diverse and fluid it can be.
Yeah, and I think that actually you touched upon something very valuable there, Lydia, because we are very different types of writers. Even in the kind of process that either of us go through.
Absolutely.
Besides where we are within our careers, and still everything about what we're doing, from our motto to our logo and the brand, it all kind of fits us. But I think it will fit a lot of different writers at different stages of their journey as well. So what I'm kind of hoping with this podcast is that every kind of writer can find a home by listening to this podcast, not just the ones like me who are just starting out, but also the established authors and everyone in between, from self-publishing to traditional publishing. I kind of hope they'll tune in and feel at home.
Yeah, well said.
Yes, definitely, and very beautifully said. So I'm going to take this back to the I don't know what the fuck I'm doing part of our motto and lighten it up, because that was so eloquent. And I came up with the best analogy last night when I was thinking about this podcast, and it was, writers are a lot like the trash bag on the side of the road, and you never know what the fuck is going to be in the bag. Is it going to be a complete set of china dishes from grandma that are worth, $5,000? Is it going to be cut up body parts? None of us know when we sit down to write, we don't know what the fuck we're doing, and it's that that bag on the side of the road. And so we all find something within this writing journey, or bring something to this writing journey that's just either complete garbage or absolute gold.
And I'm having this Bilbo Baggins moment. Well, all of them at once, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, I like the analogy with the trash bag.
We should order different t-shirt, guys. We should order trash bags.
If you want to open up that bag on the side of the road, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. Let's do it. So.
Yeah, but even as I think that's, as someone who is very heavily into plotting, I still don't know what I'm doing. Because even though I've plotted everything to death, I still don't know what I'm doing every time I start writing. And I think that might actually also be the most rewarding thing about writing in and of itself, is even though you've planned it all out, once your fingers hit that keyboard, it takes a life of its own. And you're along for the ride, whether or not you're a plotter, a plantser, or a pantser, or new, or have written 50 or 100 books. Damn, if you've written 100 books, you're insane, by the way. So
I think the journey for everybody is going to be different, and we all get that feeling as writers when we sit down to the page and we start to write, and that means something different to everyone, but at the same time everyone can relate to that feeling. So I think that's kind of where this podcast is going, in terms of, and we will be discussing in future podcasts casting versus plotting and, the process of the writing. And I'm definitely very excited to get into that, because that is my expertise to be able to bring to this. But I think in terms of relating to our listeners, I hope that when they come away from this first podcast, that's the message that we're bringing to you, our listeners. This week's Twitter poll asked what subject they were most eager to hear about. We gave 3 choices: the query letter, the synopsis, or how to plot. And we had a pretty clear favorite. So Twitter has spoken, and the question coming from the community was, how do I write a synopsis? For today, we're each going to give you an explanation of how we write a synopsis, but we will dedicate a separate, entire podcast on the mechanics of writing a synopsis and provide the how-to, step-by-step of the process.
Wow, how do I write a synopsis? I would probably start by going down a Google or YouTube rabbit hole and read as many examples as I can before I would start writing mine. I find that I personally need the visual confirmation of what others have done before me. For me, that works. When I first started out as a critique partner for Sandy, I had absolutely no idea what all these terms meant. Like, when do you even need to write a synopsis, and how is that any different from what you write as a book blurb or a query summary? And all these things are different. And I mean, these are also the things that you have to familiarize yourself with when you, not just so much when you start writing, but when you start writing as a career, or when you really want to publish something. But for as far as I know, for writing a synopsis, as opposed to writing a book blurb or a query summary, is that you actually have to give away the ending and you need to spoil everything. Don't mistake it for the blurb in which the idea is to make people thirsty for your stories without giving them any spoilers. And I thought that was the hardest thing to do by writing a synopsis, is that you literally just write out your entire book. And that felt so counterintuitive from everything you do when you kind of start writing, because you want to lure people in, and now you're kind of just putting everything out there.
I think in response to the way Sam would write a synopsis, she's got a great idea and process to be able to do that. She talks about critique partners and having to know the difference between a book blurb and a query summary and a synopsis. And how REDink Writers formed was through our critique group. So I'd like to reiterate the importance of that. And she would go look for something on YouTube or Google in terms of finding an example of what somebody else had done before her. So I would really say, bringing your synopsis to your critique partners and saying, hey, can you take a look at this? Because when you have somebody else read your work, they will often see things that you don't. And they can say, hey, what did you mean by this portion of your synopsis? That doesn't really make sense in terms of what the story is. So that's a great idea, is to go find other examples of what a synopsis is.
Yeah. I think in general, critique partners are so essential. Like, we could even fill an entire episode with the CPs and, what they do. And I think we actually have that on the episode guide as well. So we'll get to that more extensively later on. I also think, though, what Sam said, there is so much you have to keep in mind when you write a synopsis, and also the fact that you just wrote an entire book and you have to write it down in like 500 or 600 words. I remember I said it to you once, Lydia. If I could have written this book in 600 words, I would have. And yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, in one way, every writer is just lazy. If you could have done it with fewer words, you would have done it. And then there's someone telling you that you need to summarize this 90,000 words into 600 to 700 words, and you're like, okay, so where am I going to start? So yeah, I mean, the only way to get a start with this is to, get started and write it. But critique partners are essential in that, because they are the link between what the connections that you make in your mind and the connections that other people don't have.
I would agree.
I would add to that, Sandy, that if you can write a story in 500 or 600 words, I'm pretty sure that's defined as flash fiction.
Yeah, that's true. I started this whole writing thing. For me, it started with Drabbles, and that was 100-word stories, 100 words, and you had to have a full introduction, a middle part, and an ending with 100 words. And I was like, okay, so how can you even do this? And actually, it's kind of fun, because there is a mechanic in there, and the mechanic is the same. And if you understand how it works, you can write any story in 100 words or 600 words if you have to. So actually, drabbling might be a very good tip for people who struggle with writing a synopsis, now that I think of it.
However, dear listeners, please remember that flash fiction is not a synopsis. There are similarities. Yes, we should make that very clear. Yes. It is not the same thing. But
I heard someone say, yeah, you could write a story in 100 words, and I'm like, what?
Yeah, and it's a puzzle, and it's writing on a whole different level.
I don't know how to do this.
But that's the thing, you will know how. If you do it a couple of times, you discover that it's a sort of puzzle. You are playing with words rather than just writing them down, because you're going to have to count, and you're going to see, like, where do I cut words that I don't need, because you always end up having too many words. And actually, it's just such a good way to be so aware of what you are writing. It's just to drabble or write, flash fiction or anything that has just a couple of hundred words. Actually, it's kind of what I do when I write my synopsis. I kind of summarize every chapter into one line, just one single line that captures the essence of what's happening in that specific chapter. And then, usually I end up having anything between 20 or 40 chapters in my novels. So I end up with having 20 to 40 lines or sentences that will tell me what the essence of the story is. So, if I have to write a synopsis, that's basically how I do it. I summarize every chapter, I put all the lines underneath each other, and then I actually take out the whole GMC model, so the goal, motivation, conflict, and then I use that to connect all the lines together, and then I break them up into little paragraphs. So yeah, oh man, I can talk about this for like hours, I guess. But yeah, if I would have to make that really short and just give you a glimpse of how I do it, I think that's kind of it.
So how would you, because you said, I maybe have like 20 chapters, but what if you have a book that has like 40 chapters? Do you kind of just weave together and then cut lines, or?
No, it depends entirely, because usually a synopsis should be either 1 page or a 2-page synopsis, depending also on what the agent wants to have. Mm-hmm. So if it's 1 page, yeah, I start cutting things out, and I really have to keep a sharp eye on, is this essential to the main plot? You have to cut out all the subplots. You have to just focus on the one important storyline of that particular novel, and you can't put in all the side characters and all the side quests that are going on. You have to focus. And I mean, the more space you have, the more of that you can put in there. But it also goes the other way around. Like, if I only have 1 page, I need to cut it down until I have it, on 1 page.
I think that's a really great way to do that process. And as you were describing your process, I had 2 thoughts that came. One was that you're sort of stringing your synopsis along with the plot points.
Yeah.
And then, so I visualized kind of like a rope with knots, and you're tying it all together.
Yeah.
And then the other thought that I had is you're essentially plotting your story after you've written it.
Yeah, backwards.
So where Sam plots a story, and maybe this would be helpful to her in pulling what she needs into a synopsis, but she plots a story before she writes it, and then she sits down and she writes it. You are taking that plot and putting it into the synopsis. So they're very similar things. I'm sure that there's more to Sam's plot than just a 1-page synopsis, but essentially, when you really break it all down, they're very similar.
I kind of feel like I wrote a story, and then afterwards in my synopsis I go back and see what I've actually written. Oh, that's what it's about. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, you're such a pastor in that regard. But that's actually, Lydia, you make a very valid point that if you plot your novel, so for anyone who, for instance, uses beat sheets like Save the Cat, for instance, you've kind of pretty much already made a synopsis because you've been plotting your novel, which is essentially the essential points or the essential blocks that you need for your synopsis. You just have to make sure that those are actually still, like Sandra said, the essential things, because I also plot the chapters that may not be so essential to the plot, but are very essential to the character arc, which I find very interesting, because would you put more plot or more character arc in a synopsis?
Well, I think that leads into how I write a synopsis, so I'm going to touch on that a little bit. I write a synopsis like I write a grocery list. I take the story and character from point A to B to C, so you have a little bit of both. You need to have a little plot and character. Mm-hmm. And you leave out any unnecessary information like the emotions of the characters or the motivations, and you just stick to the facts of the plot points. So when I go to the grocery store, I know I need potatoes. I don't need to write on my list that I love potatoes. I already know there's a reason I want to buy them. So that's your motivation. So an agent does not need to know why the character went from the West Coast to the East Coast, just that they did it. So a synopsis should only be 1 to 2 pages long. So stick to the facts, the essential plot elements, which tell what the story is about and what your character is doing. This is the one time you can break the show, don't tell rule, and tell us what is going on, what the story is, what the plot is, what the character is doing, rather than show it.
Oh, that feels so counterintuitive.
Yeah. So yeah. If you break a rule, you break it once. And this is that rule, and this is the only time you can break that rule. Because if you try to break this rule in your manuscript, we're going to get you.
That's the thing, we're all traumatized of, teachers with rulers beating our hands when we start doing the show don't tell. We don't dare to do that anymore. And now you're telling us we should? Wow.
Yes, in your synopsis only.
Yeah, perfect.
Only in your
I would say that the show don't tell rule also, but we can do an entire episode about that as well, show don't tell, because there are people who are completely 100% don't ever tell people what you're doing in your book. But there are just some things that you do tell because they're not interesting, or a character goes from A to B and you just have to tell that they're doing that because then you can get to the showing. So it has several levels, I think, but we can do an entire podcast on it.
Yeah. You get into action in terms of telling the actions of what they're doing. So yes, you're right. We can do an entire episode on show don't tell, and we will do that. Since we're kind of going a little off topic here, we will bring that to you listeners because it seems to be a really big one.
I do like the grocery list. The I need potatoes, but I don't need to tell you why I'm going to get potatoes. Just, I love them. Yeah, that's why they're there.
Everybody loves potatoes.
Yeah, I love that analogy.
Well, not everybody, but I feel like everybody should love potatoes. But that's just me.
I don't know, it depends if they're potato chips.
So, yeah, I think if you bring back the whole REDink aspect to the synopsis, it's the same kind of idea that we've been going with of, REDink the stuff that you don't need in your synopsis, so that it keeps it really clean and concise, and an agent or an editor can read it, or even, Sam, if you don't want to bring your manuscript to an agent or an editor, I know that we've discussed self-publishing, and again, that's another whole episode, self-publishing versus traditional publishing, and none of us are for or against, or we understand and respect both methods of publishing. So it's important, even self-publishing, to maybe write out a synopsis so that when you're talking to your readers and you're putting your book out there and somebody asks you, hey, what's your story about? You've got it right there. You can.
That's such a writer meme as well. What is your story about? And writers go like, oh fuck. Yeah.
And what's the best way to make a writer shut up is ask them what their story is about.
Well, I can't just tell you my entire book because fucking quiet. But
Also, here's my brain. Have a look.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yes.
But that's a good point, because I didn't realize that that you would need a synopsis if you would choose to self-publish, because usually those things are materials you'll send to an agent, or
They are. Yes, I agree with that. I would also say that as a self-published author, if you're doing conventions or writing groups or conferences or something like that, and you sign up to be able to come sit with a table at a conference, and you're selling your books. I've done this before, and then if people walk up to your table, they want to know what your book is about, and they might read the back of it, but I often find that people would ask me directly. So being able to talk about the book is just as essential as that back cover blurb. So that's why it's really great to have kind of your synopsis written out and to really know what your plot points are for your book. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning into the very first episode of the REDink Writers Podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it, so please let us know your thoughts. Also, we would like to point out that there will be a new listeners poll on Twitter, so do give us a follow there at REDink Writers. We hope to see you again on the next episode when we discuss critique partners, friends or foes. And remember, you've got this, even if you don't know what the fuck you're doing.